What up, internet? It's McLean again. I'm here today to talk to you about two cool cameras that I'm digging. That's right, I said cool. The Canon C70 and the Canon R5. I've had these cameras for a while now, and I've shot with them a lot as an A and B cam, but I haven't had the chance to do some proper side-by-side tests, so I finally was able to do that, and I was pretty interested in what I found. So I thought I'd share that with you and give you my thoughts on the Canon C70 versus the R5. Quick disclaimer. I'm not the techiest person around. There's plenty of other very detailed videos online comparing these cameras or breaking them down. This is chill. I'm doing my best version of it, so I hope this is helpful. First thing I want to talk about is the physical size and layout of each camera. The R5, very small, mirrorless, a bit smaller than a 5D. Great layout, really feels comfortable in the hands. The buttons are all in the right spots. Versus the C70, which is actually a fair bit bigger, but definitely small for what is considered a cinema camera. The buttons are all placed in super convenient spots, very intuitive. I'd say both cameras are really, really intuitive, but the C70 is just so focused on video, where the R5 is a hybrid camera, so there aren't as many dedicated video function buttons. Not a huge deal breaker. I personally prefer the C70. And of course, with the C70, again, one of the reasons it's a bit larger is that it has a dedicated fan built in. This prevents any overheating, which is nice. You don't have to worry about overheating whatsoever with the C70. Whereas with the R5, if you're shooting in the higher quality 4K modes or 8K, you're gonna run into overheating. So one thing the R5 has that the C70 doesn't is an EVF, an electronic viewfinder. Really wish the C70 did have it, but what are you gonna do? The one on the R5 is really good. I really enjoy using it. It's a great added point of contact if you're shooting anything handheld or just need to see better outside. Very helpful to have. A big upside to the C70 is having mini XLRs built into the body. So you don't need to do dual system sound. You can plug right in if you're doing professional audio, whereas the R5 only has the little mini microphone input for something like a shotgun mic. Fine, glad it's there, but the C70 definitely wins in the audio department. The screens on both cameras are quite similar. The C70's is like a hair bigger, but hardly noticeable. I will say the R5's feels a bit more solid. Strangely, the C70's is a bit plasticky feeling. I'm not sure why that is, but that's what I've noticed. Both cameras are RF cameras. They have RF mounts on the front. This is the way Canon's going. From everything I've heard, the lenses are beautiful. I personally haven't used them. I have a whole bunch of EF glass, so I was interested in adapting my EF glass to these cameras. For the C70, there's actually a focal reducer that you can mount on the front that Canon sells. This gets you much closer to full frame. The R5 also has a Canon offered lens mount adapter for EF glass. You can get just a standard one, of course, but you can also get one with drop-in filters. So you can get a little scroll wheel for ND filters. We have a variable ND in there that goes from 1.5 to 9 stops. Not as good as the C70's ND filters internally, but great nonetheless. The sensors on the cameras. So the R5 has full frame sensor. A beautiful sensor, allows you to get very shallow depth of field, great colors, everything you'd expect from Canon. And the C70 actually has a Super 35 sensor. This is also a DGO sensor, dual gain output. To spare you all the techie stuff, basically it means you get a very clean image and a great dynamic range. I think this camera can get up to 16 stops of dynamic range, which is awesome. It's also the same sensor as the Canon C300 Mark III. Another thing that the R5 has that the C70 doesn't is IBIS, internal body image stabilization. This means that no matter what you're shooting or with what lens, you get a sensor stabilized image. Literally the sensor is stabilized. There's little things in there doing their science, and it stabilizes the image. Really handy for doing handheld work or even monopod work, takes those jitters out that you get with such a small camera. The C70 has digital stabilization. I haven't really used this. I've heard mixed things. It can, from what I've seen, give you a little of like a post-warp stabilizer effect. So those are big differences between these cameras. Both cameras have 2 card slots. The C70 has 2 SD card slots. The R5 has an SD card and a CF Express card. The CF Express is for the really high quality 4K, as well as, of course, 8K. You need that fast of a card. They are very expensive. That is a downside. Whereas the C70 has just, regular SD cards. I think you need like a V90 or faster, essentially. One of the big drawbacks of the R5 is you cannot dual record. So if you are doing documentary work or wedding work, event work, and you really need an instant backup, you cannot dual record. Before any like really techie people comment, I know the R5 can technically dual record if it's like a proxy with 8K. Not realistic, doesn't really count. Nice try though. In my opinion, the R5 not being able to dual record is one of the biggest arguments against it. I really wish that was an option. The C70 also has added video monitoring features like false color and the waveform monitor. The R5 does not have those. Okay, so now for some actual tests. I went out in the yard with the family and I wanted to test the highest quality 4K in each camera compared to each other. And this is the result. I was actually pretty surprised at how well they held up. So all the same settings, they're both shooting in C-Log 3 since the R5 recently got that firmware update. So they are both shooting in C-Log 3, same exposure settings, same ISO. They even have the same lens. They're both shooting on a 50mm lens. I'd say that the R5 has a bit more of a magenta look, whereas the C70 is slightly more green. And I can kind of see a little bit more dynamic range in the C70. But honestly, cut together, you would never know. I bet you if I didn't label these videos, you would not be able to tell between each clip. So they definitely hold up against each other. The R5 probably a little bit sharper too. I can see a little bit of, internal artificial sharpening happening. The C70's image is slightly softer, but more in a filmic and pleasing way, in my opinion. Now, it was a cloudy day, so the dynamic range was quite comparable, but if it was a sunny day and we had a bit more of an extreme highlights to shadows situation going on, I'd expect that the C70 would do a little better. And in shoots in the past, I have noticed that the C70 does hold up in the highlights very well. So I also tested the 8K versus the 4K in the C70. So the 8K in the R5 is beautiful. When that feature was announced, I kind of tossed it to the side and thought it was more of a gimmick. In actuality, it's really just such an amazing image. It's a bit sharper, obviously, than the C70, but not in that artificial way like with the 4K in the R5. So the 8K is a very beautiful image. Drawback is it eats up memory cards like it's nothing. You only get like, I think it's, on a 128 gig card, it's like maybe, 12 to 15 minutes or so. Not great, not very practical, and you will run into overheating. However, for the odd shot, really, really cool to have. Now I did a quick low light test and both cameras performed really well, but the R5 definitely won here. Just with high ISOs, the R5 can really handle it much better than the C70. Not a huge deal for me. I'm not shooting in really super dark situations very often. I'm rarely going above ISO 1600, but being able to shoot at really high ISOs and having a pretty clean image after is really nice to have, especially if you're doing run and gun stuff. However, I will say shooting in a normally lit environment, both cameras at ISO 800, you probably can't tell this on YouTube, but the C70 does have less noise, and I would credit that to the DGO sensor. The R5 is really good and holds up, but since that C-Log 3 update, it is a bit noisy. If you're gonna use this camera in C-Log 3, I'd probably overexpose a hair to bring down later, or you can always go back to regular C-Log. I'm not as big of a fan of those colors or the dynamic range, but it's an option. Okay, so autofocus. Both cameras offer great autofocus. Canon is a leader with this. Their dual pixel autofocus is really impressive. The R5 definitely smoked the C70 though. The C70 is no slouch. The tests I did had my wife walking towards the camera. The C70 had to hunt a little bit. It wasn't quite sure, especially at a distance, what object or face it was trying to track. The R5, on the other hand, saw it from the starting point, and the R5 was able to track perfectly the whole way. C70 was a bit slower, tougher to keep up, but in most situations, this probably won't be a big deal. If you're doing a lot of like action sports or movement-based stuff that you really need good autofocus, then the R5's the winner. The C70, if you're doing interviews or anything that, a lot of this is happening, or what's over there? Autofocus. Oh, hey, it's still on me? Great, cool. Then the C70 will hold up, but the R5 wins for sure. Battery life on both cameras is really good. The C70 definitely has longer battery life with the larger batteries. You can even get a really fatty battery and go almost double the length of one. I take 2 of the regular size batteries with me on an all-day shoot, totally fine. The R5 ships with a slightly larger capacity LPE6 variant. battery. It performs really well. It gives you a little more battery life, maybe like 20% more than your standard LPE6s. So I have one of those and 3 or 4 regular LPE6 batteries, and that gets me through a day just fine, especially if I'm turning the camera off between shots or takes. So overheating. This is something you will have to think about with the R5. C70, you won't at all. That dedicated fan allows you to shoot dual record 4K for as long as you want. R5, you are gonna run into some overheating issues if you shoot in any of the high quality 4K modes or 8K, of course. You get a lot of time out of it, so it's more if you're doing like interviews or long A-roll stuff that you'd have to be really conscious of it. I've shot a lot with the standard 4K, and that's beautiful, totally holds up in most situations for what I need for A-roll, but something to keep in mind. Okay, to sum up, both cameras are really, really great. They're perfect as a pair, as an A and B cam, and I was hoping through these tests that I'd have a bit more of a conclusive answer, that I'd see that one is clearly better than the other, but it really just comes down to personal preference and what your needs are. For me, I will keep the C70 as my A cam. I prefer the image, looks a bit more natural and filmic to my eye, and of course having all those video features built onto the body is something that I really value. The R5 though is an amazing camera and would serve as a great A cam for a lot of people. If you're looking for something really small, that's light, that you can throw on a gimbal rather quickly, that performs great in low light, that has IBIS, and you're not too concerned about slightly shorter battery life or a lack of built-in internal NDs or dual recording or any of those other drawbacks, then the R5 is definitely a solid option. And of course on the flip side, if you want something, again, quite small, but has all those cinema camera features, can do dual record, then the C70 is probably best suited for you. It'll be interesting to see what Canon does next. I know there's rumors out there of like a souped up version of the R5. That ought to be interesting. But ultimately Canon and all other camera manufacturers are they're closing the gap between like entry-level cameras and really, really professional high-end cameras. And that's super exciting. It allows so many more people to have the tools to get the job done and produce beautiful imagery, of course, if they know what they're doing with it. But those are my thoughts. I hope you found this helpful. I would love it if you liked and subscribed, because YouTube and algorithms and all that stuff. And if you want to see any other videos, let me know in the comments below. And let me know what you think about each image and what your preference is between the two. Until next time, bye.